Hi, Ian.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing well.
Good.
I'm on vacation.
Yes, I envy you. As it happens, we're both at a vacation location, which explains why, in a very rare event for my show, I'm actually in physical proximity to the person I'm talking to. We're at your lovely place in a secure, undisclosed location, as they used to say about Dick Cheney. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Ian Bremmer. You have a number of things we could brag about. You are founder and president of the Eurasia Group, which is paid by companies with a financial stake in various parts of the world to tell them what's going to happen in these various parts of the world. Is that more or less accurate?
Maybe more to tell them what is happening in these parts of the world. We don't do as much futurology.
With all due respect to your clients, you sometimes need to start there. Fine. And you are also professor of what? Political science at NYU?
Yes.
And you are the author of a number of books. Most recently, Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalization. We're going to talk about this. Not only about this probably, but we are going to talk about this. And I think, actually, you could describe this a couple of ways. Really enjoyed it. You could describe it as like the antithesis of Steven Pinker, I think, almost. Steve wrote a famously optimistic book called Enlightenment Now recently, and this is not relentlessly grim, but it's more cautionary, I would say, than Steve's view of the future world.
I agree.
It's also a kind of a comment on the Trump moment. You're saying, Trump, don't reassure yourself with the false idea that he's some fluke who was brought to us by Russian hackers. He's symptomatic of deeper discontents that derive from structural causes, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. And it's not just America. You're seeing this in Europe and in other parts of the world. In fact, the book is largely about other parts of the world.
Yeah, it's not.
But I want to start on a family, talking about family background, because one thing you and I have in common, I'm not sure if you know this, but both of us have siblings who voted for Trump. I actually win this contest. I have 3. You have 1.
Well, I only have 1 sibling.
Well,
so I'm batting 1,000.
Hey, you should have had. You should have. If you had been, more prescient, you would have had more. But and you start the book off talking about your family background.
Yep.
Because I think you think it has some relevance to actually maybe helps you understand the current moment better than maybe some people who grew up in more privileged backgrounds. Is that the idea?
Well, I mean, I think there's something really straightforward about using my experience in this book, which I never talk about usually. I certainly haven't done any of my books before. And it's kind of this basic idea that people feel that the system and those in power kind of are rigged against them. That idea that capitalism is not for all, because most people, certainly no one I grew up with, are capitalists because they don't have capital. That's like a fairly straightforward point, right? And yet it's one that's lost with elites across the entire political spectrum in the West who have decided that we're all capitalists. And so therefore we should all just knee-jerk support free trade. We should knee-jerk support open borders. We should knee-jerk support the United States and our allies going to fight wars around the world to ensure that the world can be made safe for democracy, whatever that means. And I think the fact that my brother and your siblings voted for Trump, I don't think my brother's a racist. I really don't.
Right.
I really don't. But I think he believes that we've been lied to by a lot of people. And for him, it's not about Trump. I do think Trump is an anomaly because Trump individually is such is so antithetical
right.
to all the kind of, no one wants to be like Trump. No one wants their kids to be like Trump. But I think Trumpism, the idea that we want to throw the bums out, we want to break the system, we want to protest against everyone in the media, everyone in positions of corporate and financial authority, certainly politicians that are in the establishment, and even most of the public intellectuals like you and me, I think that's real, and I think it deserves some honesty, as opposed to just saying we hate Trump, if we get rid of Trump, everything will be fine.
I know.
Okay, fine.
So I'm curious. Have you talked to your brother much about why he voted for Trump?
A little bit. We don't. I mean, this is not. My family has never moved on politics. I'm a political scientist. I'm not a part of a political party.
Right.
And so I don't get agitated by people's political views, their religious views. I mean, let's face it, so much of this is on the basis of the accident of birth. I mean, nationalism, the same thing. So I've just never been someone that's gotten really worked up over that in terms of my personal identity.
Right.
And so when he told me he voted for Trump, I was a little surprised, but mostly in terms of, okay, now let me dig into why it was that I'm surprised. What are because my mother clearly never would have voted for Hillary or Jeb Bush. She read the National Enquirer every week when I grew up. It was always in the house. I read it frequently as well. I didn't really understand it, but I got it. And for her, like, the National Enquirer was not a bunch of lies. It was a deeper truth. It was a truth that was saying, yeah, these people are lying to you. Yeah, you are being taken advantage of. And it was that together with Alex Jones style, sort of aliens are coming to abduct you, which is like kind of entertaining and fun and stupid, but it didn't feel to her at least that she was being taken advantage of by reading this crap. It was more that I'm not going to just listen to what is being told to me, that I know these people don't have my interests at heart. They're never going to take care of my kids. They're never going to give us the American dream. I'm going to have to fight for that.
Okay. So I think a common view is, of the problem that you emphasize economic factors, right?
In part.
And I mean, I guess how would you... People who think Trump is some kind of fluke, and then once we get rid of him, we'll be okay. And I take your point that Trump per se is a fluke. He's just almost too weird to happen twice. But maybe if you tell us what parts of what he represents are more enduring. What could you, if you couldn't have predicted something as weird as Trump, you could have predicted what? Nationalism, nativism,
right?
What? So and so tell us what you could have predicted and why you could have predicted it.
Much more protectionism, much more support for traditional industries in the United States and closing up borders and beating on other countries economically, whether or not it works. Much more backlash against open borders and immigration into the United States. Why would we take care of these new people coming in when you're not taking care of people that have lived here for a long time? Much more opposition to U.S.-led multilateral architecture, institutions, alliances, the UN, NATO, NAFTA, things like that. Much more opposition to American military force all over the world. The idea that the Americans should be fighting in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and Yemen, and all of these places, whether directly or through our allies and with our military equipment and paramilitaries and things like that. I think that all of those things are growing structurally across most of the West and will continue to grow irrespective of who the American president happens to be. Let's keep in mind that it's growing right now with the Dow at record levels, with American growth last quarter with a 4 handle, and with global growth relatively robust.
Right.
So, I mean, if that's happening now, what's it going to look like when suddenly we can't do the deficit spending that we've done in the last year, that suddenly we can't give everyone the tax benefits and the bonuses at the end of the year, and the companies start actually firing folks and belt tightening? You have to expect that this backlash to globalism, not globalization, not the idea that global growth comes from open borders, because that's true, but globalism, the idea that the average person in the West should support a political philosophy that promotes free trade and open borders and American troops everywhere and all the rest, that I think is in for a very big correction, and we're only seeing the beginning of that right now.
Okay. Let's start off by talking about foreign policy. It's not the thing that's most often mentioned in this context. It was certainly a salient part of Trump's campaign.
Absolutely.
The claim that he was going to do what he hasn't exactly done yet, which is stifle the kind of interventionist impulse. But the way you first came to my attention was on Twitter when, with me, agreeing with a lot of your tweeting. Actually, you seem a little skeptical of military intervention. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, can you explain why we keep intervening in places? I mean, I don't think we have to recite the litany. I mean, Iraq, then Libya, morphs from a protecting the civilians thing to regime change. We were more active in, I think, kind of accelerating the Syrian civil war than some people realized. We were funneling a lot of arms in there and so on, and that turned out to have been a lost cause that we only made worse in the meanwhile. And now Trump, you see him wanting to he wants to get the troops out of Syria. He's got this impulse.
And yet,
Iran, are we both going to mention Iran? Is that I mean, that seems to me the most glaring continuation of the pre-existing American foreign policy impulse.
Absolutely. Yeah, certainly Trump's policies on Iran feel more neoconservative-ish. Bolton to Cheney, you can draw kind of a dotted line there. And in fact, I would argue he's probably been more hawkish on Iran than Hillary Clinton would have been if she were president.
Well, she wouldn't have torn up the deal.
Right, the Iran deal she would not have. And the actual policy of Trump in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, other places, looks more consistent with what Obama was doing than his policies in most other things, both domestically and internationally. And I think a big part of that, I think his impulse when he was running was absolutely, let's get these troops out. Why are we spending all this money? Like what he said on North Korea, why are we doing all these military exercises? Why do we have all these troops in South Korea? But the reality is that he has actually done something else he said he was going to do when he was running, which is listen to his generals. And he doesn't have any experience in this stuff. And he's basically had Mattis and now Secretary of State Pompeo, before National Security Advisor McMaster. He was basically letting them run with the ball on most of these policies, which means stasis. And why do we do it? Well, the United States spends more on its military than the next 8 countries in the world combined. It is the place where we are most obviously an unchallenged hegemon. Hegemonic power, and we've got bases all over the world. We want to win. Other countries don't do what we want. Other leaders don't do what we want, and frequently we turn to the military option when that happens, and it doesn't go well for us. But it particularly doesn't go well for the people that feel screwed, right? I mean, when you think about who voted for Trump or who would have voted for Bernie Sanders, look at the communities of the people that were sent, the enlisted men and women and their families that were sent to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you're going to find those are the people that are voting for Bernie and for Trump, and frequently not voting at all because they feel like the system is rigged against them. They're giving everything. This is much worse than just having your real wage being stagnant for 40 years while the top 10% is doing so much better. This is, you've actually been sent to fight and die in a war that the Americans have failed at, and your family hasn't been taken care of on the back of that. I can't think of anything that would be more unacceptable. And something I didn't write about in the book, I probably should have. My father was an enlisted man for 21 years and was in Korea. And my mother, was effectively she left before finishing high school. She was an officer's wife, and I think that there was a lot of anger around the enlisted men and women and what that meant for them and their families and their communities that she had.
Yeah, it's odd that this is said to be a big part of Trump's support, but he's still very militaristic in his rhetoric, and was all along in a way. way. I mean, it's just an interesting combination of a belligerent nationalism and anti-interventionism that I don't think is entirely a product of him having been kind of swallowed by the establishment. Although I think that's happened now, and that accounts for Iran. But I mean, it was kind of always part of his shtick, right?
Well, it's kind of parallel with the draining the swamp mantra. I mean, on the one hand, he really never liked those CEOs. He thought he was never going to be a part of that group. He was an outsider from Queens, real estate guy doing second and third order deals because he wasn't let into the nice rooms, that sort of thing. And yet, when you look at his actual policies, tax policy, regulatory rollback, I mean, he's the wet dream of the average, sort of billionaire or hedge fund, sort of oligarch or major CEO in terms of his policies. And I think that you have a similar kind of dynamic at play with these fights that the Americans have all over the world. Trump's natural impulse, America First impulse, is why are we supporting NATO? What does it do for us? We understand why we support it for the Europeans. They're the ones that are vulnerable to migrants and refugees. They're the ones vulnerable to the Russians and their interventions. But they're the ones close to the Middle East. But why do we care? Right. Not as clear to the average American. And I think that Trump has a fairly obvious populist message and set of populist policies that he could actually implement on, but he hasn't.
That's interesting because I thought he might go that way. Steve Bannon wanted him to go more that way, right? I mean, Steve Bannon has said, I wanted him to raise taxes on rich people, right? I mean, yes. You could imagine a Trump that becomes a real challenge to the very structure of the two-party system. Like, he's so far from being either Democrat or Republican. In other words, he goes kind of left-wing populist, but more like a Buchananite conservative with kind of more left-wing domestic policies, I guess. But he hasn't done that, right? I mean, he's pretty much let the Republican establishment have its way
domestically,
in terms of domestic policy.
Yeah, and even on trade, in terms of he's talked tough, but the reality is that on almost all of these issues, he's ended up trying to work to find a deal with before people get too upset and their portfolios get too hurt. The exception so far has been China, but China's the one place where most of the establishment, the moneyed establishment in the U.S., is actually getting angrier because they feel like they don't have the ability to make the kind of coin they used to. China has a different rule set. They're getting much stronger. But, there's so many ways that, as I said, I think Trump is anomalous. I think we talk internationally. You can look at Brexit. You can look at the Italian government. You can look at what's happened in Eastern Europe. You can look at the French elections. Those things all feel of a piece. Doug Ford in Canada. Trump individually is so unusual because of his emotional brittleness, because of his extreme narcissism, and also because of his his ability to destroy himself. I mean, we're seeing with the investigations as they expand. I mean, this is going to get much more divisive because of Trump himself, rather than what you'd see with a more traditional populist candidate. Yeah.
No, he is sui generis in a lot of ways.
Yes.
But I guess what you're saying was predictable was nationalist, native, populist, whether it was more of a Buchananite conservative or something a little to the left, and you don't think it's going to go away?
No, I see no reason to believe it's going to go away. I mean, in fact, if you look at Trump's policies, they're really doing nothing long-term to alleviate any of these issues. He's a lot of big giveaways in the near term. Again, blow out the budget and it's Christmas for everybody. But if you ask what are the things that these people need, better infrastructure investment, better educational investment that's sustainable for the long term, dealing with healthcare for the long term. Trump's making none of those things better for these people. Right. In fact, it's when it becomes unsustainable, we have a downturn, who do you think is going to take the hit? Yeah. Is it the billionaires with offshore accounts, or is it the people that really don't have access to the way to pull themselves up by their bootstraps? So do you see a downturn coming? I mean, this is like the longest stock market boom in I don't know how long. In history, I believe. Yeah. So you see
you see hard times coming?
I'm not an economist, but when I talk to serious economists, on average they believe a downturn is 2020. I certainly worry that growth in productivity is lower than we would like, given the extraordinary efficiencies of technology that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. Some of that may well come from the fact that a lot of the people that we want to participate in growing consumption aren't able to participate in the in this bull market. Mm-hmm. But leaving aside, I mean, even if the bull market continues, the fact that so many Americans, Europeans, Canadians, Australians feel that this is not good for them. And what we know is that technology is displacing more and more people that are in that group. Now, I'm not saying that I know that there won't be jobs going forward. I don't know that. There are a lot of people that are technologists that believe that there are definitely going to be jobs, and I think they don't know that either. But it's very clear that for the average, certainly sub-college graduate in the United States that's really taken it on the chin in the old working and middle class, these people are going to get destroyed by this new industrial revolution driven by technology and automation, unless something serious and structural is done for them, which is not on the table politically.
Well, and the automation is going to, in terms of who it threatens, it's going to climb the income scale, right?
That's right.
It's more and more white-collar, people are going to be threatened.
The entry-level white-collar people, it's the early-stage accountants, it's the paralegals, it's the financial analysts that aren't very good, that just started, or those that are kind of more expensive, but they aren't really differentiated. Mm-hmm. That's absolutely going to put enormous pressure on top of these governing institutions that just aren't getting it done for the average people. I mean, you have to understand that, from my perspective, this was the most important election of my lifetime, right? Trump versus Hillary Clinton. You couldn't come up with sort of two more antithetical political figures that were running. And yet, number one, Trump won. Yeah, he didn't win the popular vote, but he won the election as it existed. It shouldn't have even been close, given what Trump is like as a candidate. Number two, an enormous number of people didn't bother to vote. Right. People didn't vote. That's a larger number than voted for Hillary by a significant margin. So that really tells you something. That says that the American political system is pretty broken. I think it is.
Yeah.
It's not broken for you and me, but I think it actually, you can't say that we're a strong, functional, representative democracy today. You just can't say that.
No, one of my siblings said, in explaining the vote, the Trump vote, I just wanted to throw a wrench into the works.
Right.
You hear that kind of thing a lot. And I think part of Trump's appeal, when he would say things that we just thought were like crazy, like no politician would ever say them, that was a feature, not a bug, from the point of view of people who hate the system. It's proof that he's not a politician.
Trump going after McCain.
Yeah, exactly.
After he's dead. I mean, look, if he had decided that from day one he was going to pretend that he liked McCain and that he was going to do something nice for him, not only would the left not found it credible, and rightly so, but also he would have appeared to be yet another politician as usual. And no one that supported him wanted that.
Yeah.
And I think that, the fact is that the media in this country, really goes after all of this stuff, which is precisely why people voted for him to begin with. Like, yeah, it's because we don't like you.
Right. Let's talk about the media a little, because I have my view about this. I mean, I've been in journalism.
Yeah.
What is your take on how New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal are covering this?
Look, I still read them, and I think I have a lot of friends in those places. I think Maggie Haberman at the New York Times, David Nakamura at the Washington Post. These are personal friends, but they're also fantastically hardworking people that are trying to get at the truth. Mm-hmm. So, but I also know that the reason why circulation numbers are up at these institutions and viewership is up at CNN and MSNBC and Fox is because they've gone completely polarizing. And they cover Trump all the time. And it's become pure filter bubbles. It's only a place for you. It's us versus them. There's nothing in between. There's no overlap. It's enormously unhealthy for our country. And yet, if they didn't do that, they were getting destroyed by social media and by new form. And so what are we supposed to do? It's corporatized. I mean, the answer might be that we need something like the BBC in the United States.
Well, nominally we have things like that, but they have their own issues. I mean, NPR and PBS, but...
I think they're pretty good, but they're really small.
Yeah.
Right? And they're really narrow, and they're really elite, and that's the problem.
I actually think the Wall Street Journal, I'm not a fan of the editorial page, certainly, but the reportorial section, I think they're doing a better job than the Post or the Times of staying a little detached.
Agreed.
I mean, it's the first thing I read now.
And indeed, on the recent Cohen story, the Wall Street Journal actually broke quite a bit of that.
Yeah.
That was their investigative process.
Yeah. And, it's like I wondered, I mean, the Cohen story is an interesting case because, like, it was a big story. The president is implicated in something that is nominally a felony. At the same time, if she had said, I'll stay quiet for $5,000, it wouldn't have been a crime at all, as I understand it, because it was about something that qualifies as a contribution that's more than $25,000 or something. And the Times, in the physical edition, ran it across all 6 columns, and I thought, like, what are they going to do if there's a smoking gun on the Russian collusion? Like, add 2 columns to the newspaper for that headline? I mean, it was a significant thing, but I do think they're kind of...
Well, it's the combination of gotcha politics and having the volume at 10 on everything.
Right.
So you have no ability to actually tell people this is or is not a big thing that you need to focus on. Right. And Trump loves that. Because it makes him the feature news every single moment of every day. So it's not like Trump doesn't want this. Trump wants this coverage. He wants that fight. When he says John Brennan, former director of the CIA, who's politicizing his fight with Trump for his own purposes, I'm going to make you news today because I want Omarosa off the page, they're all complicit.
Right.
They're absolutely. Some of them are more complicit in a knowing way, and some of them perhaps in a more subconscious way, but I think it's still the same thing. With CNN, of course, what they've come to realize is that Trump is the plane crash that keeps on happening. Mm-hmm. So, with the old, like when we lost that plane, sort of the Malaysian airline plane, and no one could find it, CNN was like, wow, we've got like this great story that we're going to cover this all the time because it's breaking news. Well, Trump has given that to them for a minimum of 4 years. Yeah. That's astonishing for them.
Yeah, and so it seems to me that we're almost just kind of like the battle lines are drawn. It's getting hard to move the needle on public opinion because you do have like 40% of the people, or at least of those, the ones who are polled, who they support Trump, and it's almost hard to imagine anything changing that. Partly because they're going to distrust the sources that inform them about anything egregious he does. I mean, do you see? And to me, it seems like maybe this is. Sometimes I think his basic strategy, to the extent there is one, and of course Trump is a more, shall we say, spontaneous person than many. So sometimes strategic is not the right word, but if there's a strategy implicit, it seems to me an anti-impeachment strategy for starters. Hang on to enough of the base that he just that he can't wind up getting impeached, right?
Sure. I mean, now let's be clear that his decision to fire Comey, the former FBI director, which I'm sure felt great at the time, undermined that, right? Because so his inability to control his own emotional impulses and his unwillingness to listen to those with expertise that are trying to help him protect himself has been perhaps his single biggest failing as a president. But taking that aside, I mean, the extraordinary emotional challenges of Trump himself, his impulsiveness, I do think that you can find strategies in what Trump is trying to do. And one piece of that strategy is make the narrative about yourself all the time and have a base that you are speaking to and create the us versus them in every way. Use race, use identity politics, use nationalism. He's done that effectively. I also think be a bully. And the United States is the most powerful country in the world, and Trump's impulse is to use that strength to beat up on other countries, other actors, and maybe that doesn't work long term, but you know what? Trump's not president long term. Short term, he's a politician's politician. In that regard, that's a strategy. And in some countries, that's actually been fairly effective for him.
Yeah. Now, kind of speaking of beating up on countries, so one of the main things you do for a living is assess risk.
Sure.
You actually give people quantitative probabilities about things happening, I assume, right?
Qualitative and quantitatively, sure, yeah.
So war with Iran. What are the chances we'll bomb Iran before the election?
I think they're a lot higher than I'd like them to be. The fact that the United States has pulled out. So here's an interesting dynamic. Iran versus North Korea. With North Korea, no matter what the United States does, the actual power that determines outcomes over North Korea largely is in the hands of the Chinese and, to a degree, the South Koreans, not the United States. We are a comparatively marginal player. Militarily, there's not all that much we can do without enormous risk to ourselves and the global economy. And meanwhile, the North Korean economy is driven largely by what the Chinese and the South Koreans do, not the United States. With Iran, we have credible military strategies. They may not be ones that you and I would like, but they're credible. And we also can drive economic outcomes for Iran because other countries just aren't as invested, so they'd much rather listen to our sanctions, which means they can still do business with American banks, for example. And so the ability of Donald Trump to really put the squeeze on Iran and determine outcomes, make regime change more dangerous for them, give them no options but to either accept a more challenging deal from scratch with us that would be enormously embarrassing and problematic for the Iranian government, or to escalate and push back. We can do that. And I think Trump is doing that. And so as a consequence, the likelihood that the Iran deal stays in place in some way with other countries is virtually zero. The likelihood that the Iranians do restart some level of advanced nuclear uranium enrichment and nuclear research seems higher.
You think?
Yeah, I mean,
that's kind of inviting bombing, isn't it?
Right, and to be fair, they're already getting bombed in Syria by the Israelis, and the Iranians haven't responded to that. So there's already a level of military confrontation. Some of it's proxy, some of it's direct. What we haven't seen is the Americans or the Israelis engaging directly in attacking Iran itself.
Which is a big difference.
I
mean, they can't let that go. I mean, you would
but it doesn't have to be war. I mean, that could be we hit the Syrians directly. Under Trump, we hit the Syrians, something Obama never wanted to do. They were massive, the red lines, all of that. Trump's done it twice now.
Right.
Syrian response, de minimis. I could see an Israeli or a Trump surgical military strike in response to some perceived and real Iranian misbehavior after the deal has fallen apart that doesn't lead to the Iranians saying we're suddenly going to have all-out war with the United States, with Israel, with Saudi Arabia, which they would get destroyed in.
Seems hard for them politically to not lob some missiles, get somebody to lob some missiles into Tel Aviv or something. I mean, it's just tough to take it completely lying down as a political matter.
If you go directly missiles into Tel Aviv, the likelihood that the escalation is really hard to control becomes much greater. So I think that there is a higher likelihood now that we get the Iranians crying uncle and saying, we're willing to talk with you, probably through the Europeans, not directly the Americans, willing to talk with you about what we're doing on ballistic missiles, willing to talk with you about a sunset clause, willing to talk with you for the nuclear deal, willing to talk with you about what we're doing with proxies. I think there's also a greater likelihood, much greater, that the Iranians will take steps that will be seen as overtly provocative by the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Americans, and the Israelis. Those steps seem to me make some form of direct military confrontation between our two countries greater. It's not 2%. It's 20, it's 30, it's 40. I think the likelihood of all-out war between Iran and the U.S., Iran, Israel, and the U.S. is greater than I'd like, but it's not 20, 30, 40%.
Right.
It's more like 2% or 5%. Now, look, that's still much higher than we want it to be, right? But if you ask me, like, in the grand scheme of things, what do you worry about? Iran or North Korea? You worry about Iran. Yeah.
Yeah, I wasn't that worried about North Korea, honestly, because I tend to think the rationality of foreign leaders of an authoritarian stripe seems to get underestimated, including in Iran. I mean, it's interesting that you're describing Iran...
And the United States, by the way. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, although rationality is a less safe assumption than ever under Trump, I think. But it's interesting that you're describing...
I don't know if I agree with that.
What?
I think we do the same thing. I think that frequently, with leaders that we really can't stand,
right,
we immediately presume irrationality, where most of the time, a host of constraints, both their own risk aversion as well as the ways decisions are made and all the rest, leads to less irrational behavior on the part of these actors.
Yeah. No, I think it's hard to imagine Trump doing something militarily that Mattis just says, this is crazy.
Right.
So there are all kinds of constraints on him. But that aside, it's interesting that you're describing Iran as this highly rational actor, and yet when you hear a lot of the rhetoric about why we need to contain Iran, why we need to subdue Iran, its assumption is that they're not rational actors. Isn't that right? I mean, in other words, the idea is, they've got they're getting closer to Israel. Well, that's only a problem if they are not subject to deterrence, right? And I haven't seen much evidence that they're not subject to deterrence.
I was with Netanyahu a few years ago when he was giving a speech to a bunch of financial, sort of CEOs, and a very wealthy audience, obviously. And he starts off by talking about the existential threat of Iran towards Israel. And then, 20 minutes later, he's talking about all these he pivots to economics and talks about how amazing Israel is as a destination for investment. So I raise my hand. I'm like, can you tell me which part of the speech I'm supposed to take away? Because, if it's really an existential threat, then these guys really shouldn't be investing there, right? Ha, ha, ha. And, of course, the reality is that the irrationality of Iran is a device that's used to help demonize a government we don't like. And we have very good reasons not to like them.
What are the best reasons?
Well, there are lots. Number one is a theocratic regime that has promoted actively a number of organizations and governments in the Middle East and beyond that are opposed to our allies in the region. That's number one. So, they're on the other side. In Syria. They're with the Russians in Syria. They're with Assad in Syria. They're actually much more important in Syrian outcomes on the ground than the Russians are.
But I guess maybe my question is, you are of a somewhat realist persuasion in foreign policy, I guess. Would you characterize something?
Well, I'm certainly not of a neoconservative persuasion.
Okay.
I'm probably more of a power interdependence guy.
I guess my question is, isn't the fact that they are on the other side almost arbitrary? In other words, why should we be an ally of Saudi Arabia's to begin with, right? It's not like our own national interest dictates alliance with Saudi Arabia.
Well, look, I would say, number one, the fact that the Americans and Saudis have over many decades worked to develop willingness to share intelligence and willingness to coordinate military. You don't want to necessarily throw out a relationship that you have built over decades because that's actually useful. So even if you can say, well, wait a second, Iran makes more sense as a long-term market for the United States. We've got a lot more oil now. They have a lot more people. They're more educated. Wouldn't we want to invest there? You'd still say, but, what about all these relations? That's why we don't want to get rid of NATO, why we don't want to get rid of NAFTA. That's why TPP was a good idea. All those things. You also have the fact that the Iranians have developed a ballistic missile program that is potentially threatening to other countries in the region. They have acted in a destabilizing way.
If they're not rational, that's a big problem. But if they are, why is it different from all the other countries that have ballistic missiles?
Oh, no, but look, absolutely true. If they make mistakes, if the theocracy is a regime that we think is not very stable over the long term, if you ask me, I think that the Saudi government is probably more stable than the Iranian government. And the idea that Trump's policies make regime change in Iran more likely is even more destabilizing, right? So I certainly think if we presume a level of rationality on the part of most of these actors, the idea that Iran was going to directly, seriously threaten Israel is ludicrous. Right. Because Israel's got at least 100 nukes. They've never admitted to it, but we all know it. Their air force is extraordinary. Right. They've got cyber capabilities.
You'd have to be literally crazy.
And yet the Iranians continue to be the biggest supporter of Hezbollah in the region, which has.
But I mean, don't you think? It seems to me one of the most common mistakes in foreign policy analysis is to interpret moves that are defensive in the mind of the nation as offensive. I mean, Iran has been. They were attacked viciously by Iraq, and the victims of basically a genocidal campaign.
Right.
The America's basically sided with Iraq during that.
So let's keep in mind, we also did change the old Iranian regime in the 50s.
It goes back that far.
That's right.
So, I mean, the idea that Iran would want the most assertive possible forward defense, and of course Iran views Israel as an ally of ours, if not, I don't know who they consider the proxy, but in any event, I mean, it seems plausible, certainly, to have a presence in Syria.
Right.
I think is easily, if you ask why did they support the brutal Assad regime, that's not hard to explain in terms of essentially a defensive posture.
Sure,
right?
Yeah, but the Americans have supported brutal regimes too. But then you have other countries that are much less likely to support brutality, even when it's in their ostensible or putative interest. So the fact that the Iranians have a theocracy and are engaged in extraordinary suppression, complete suppression of opposition when it suits their purposes.
Like some of our allies in the region, like Egypt, like Saudi Arabia.
Sure, yeah, I mean,
Egypt.
Egypt definitely. Saudi Arabia, I think, is getting a little bit better now, and that's causing more instability in Iran. But all interesting points. And look, one of the reasons why I have a problem with nationalism is because at some level, this stuff is pretty arbitrary, right? I mean, I like the United States a lot, but I happen to live here. And it's hard for me to say, but certainly when I grew up, I felt a lot more comfortable promoting a lot of what the United States stood for. My grandmother came through Ellis Island. She had been persecuted, faced a genocide.
Where'd she come from?
Aleppo, but Armenia. She's Armenian. So the idea that the United States was the place that my grandparents wanted to come to make a life for their family is something that really means a lot to me. The fact that we have a country now that's less interested in that makes me, if you ask me, is America the greatest country in the world? It's still the country that, I have all to thank for my opportunity. Started a company from scratch. No one was helping me. I couldn't do that just about anywhere else in the world. And yet there are a lot of things that America does that makes me deeply uncomfortable, including our military efforts all over the world. And I think that it's deeply self-destructive in the long term.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to get back. I want to get back to your book. First, there's a question I've asked a lot of people. I've never gotten a satisfactory answer. You mentioned oil in the context of I guess the context being you'd like to have, if you did need oil, you'd like to have allies who have it. I've never understood that because whether Saudi Arabia is our ally or not, they're going to... Now, it's true that they control the spigot a little, but leave that aside. If you accept that basically an oil-exporting nation is going to export a fair amount of oil, whether they're exporting it to you or not, they're going to put it on the global market. It's going to have the effect on prices that it's going to have. It's going to lower prices just in putting it on the market. So you buy it from somebody else at the same price that Saudi Arabia is selling it to your enemy to or whatever. I've never understood why we have to be on great terms with like every oil exporter or a majority of them, or what am I missing?
Well, number one, obviously you're missing the oil shock in the 70s when OPEC actually turned against the West and said, no, that's it. We're actually going to...
If you assume an oligopolistic cabal, I guess, right.
Correct. And I think, it's one of the reasons why the United States has been much more interested in having some level of energy independence. And certainly the energy revolution, shale, for example, which now means that the United States by the end of this year will be the largest oil producer in the world, it means that you no longer have to worry about deeply unstable states with leaderships that can control life.
Your dog wants in on this conversation.
He wants in on this conversation. Yeah, he does. It creates a problem. Right? It absolutely means that their influence goes down. And I think that the fact there's a big difference between Saudi Arabia with oil production that is controlled by a family with a state-owned company, and the United States, where even if the U.S. decides we want to take some oil, start pumping out of our strategic petroleum reserve, the fact is that how much we do or don't produce on a daily basis is going to be determined by a very large amount of producers who are in the private sector. Right? So it's a very different story. So much of the world's energy, and in the 70s, a significant majority of it was actually determined, that production was determined by states that were authoritarian and companies that they owned and controlled. I think that's the difference.
Yeah, but if there is a bit more or less unified global oil price, it seems to me like they can't hurt us without hurting everybody else, in the market. But I don't want to.
Well, that's the same argument that you make about why there shouldn't be a trade war between the U.S. and China. There's mutual interdependence.
Right.
And yet, it's absolutely plausible that the United States, in a stronger position, in order to get the Chinese to do things we want, will go through some significant rounds of escalation that will cause a lot of damage.
Yeah, that's not irrational to do bargaining that way. I mean, but about the book,
But if you're asking, do I think the United States has massively overspent in history to promote the interests of countries that have oil, the answer is yes. And have we done so being irresponsible about the lives of our own citizens, never mind the lives of citizens of other places that we clearly don't value? And the answer is, of course, overwhelmingly yes.
And have we gotten in bed with dictators in a way that not only is dubious on moral grounds, but turns out to invite blowback from people like Osama bin Laden and blah, blah, blah?
Overwhelmingly.
So you agree that our foreign policy is pretty much a disaster or not?
I agree that so much of our foreign policy in past decades has been enormously short-sighted. I wouldn't say it's always been a disaster. Let's keep in mind the U.S. spends more on humanitarian aid around the world than any other country in the world, and it's significant. It really matters. Let's keep in mind the United Nations was created by us,
right,
and there are values, and that the WTO was created by us. So, I mean, the big institutional structures that exist because of American values and the American system. And I'm very proud of those institutions.
Yeah.
But in the past, certainly since I've been an adult, on balance, I would say I've been more disheartened by much of new American foreign policy than I've been supportive of.
And we have in some ways, it seems to me, undermined the authority and credibility of the United Nations by casually disregarding the Security Council when we want to invade Iraq, and doing it without Security Council support.
Right? I mean, the Security Council doesn't really function because everyone has a singular veto of the permanent members, and so as a consequence, you can't
so it's supposed to act as a restraining force for that reason. Yeah. I mean, if the Security Council is the only authorizer of the use of military force that isn't obviously in self-defense, which is basically what it was designed to be, and you give these 5 powerful countries veto power, that is, if that's respected, it becomes a real constraint on aggression.
But let's keep in mind that when we created that and we put those permanent members in place, we put the permanent members in that were our friends that we thought were going to agree with us in consensus and this sort of thing. Why is Japan not a permanent member? Why is Germany not a permanent member? I mean, today you look at the Security Council.
Well, it's also the winners of the war.
Exactly.
That we wanted.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So the reason why you had that structure was not because, well, that will make sure that this is the only way you legitimize force. It's because we knew that those were our friends, so they would agree with us on this stuff. And, well, now they aren't our friends, and the Russians aren't our friends, right? The Chinese aren't our friends, and so they disagree with us. We can't get stuff done, so we ignore them. That should be a surprise to nobody.
No, but I think the world would be better if we didn't ignore them. I mean, I think it was...
Of course, you're right.
Right, and it was within our power, I think, when the Cold War ended. I think people underestimate the power of norms about having to do with the respect for the rule of law, including international law.
Yeah, but the Americans have never been good at that.
Well,
never.
You know, right after the Cold War, remember the first Iraq War, George Bush, the first George Bush, went through the motions. He got the Security Council. Clinton got it for Bosnia. There were minor exceptions, but the really egregious ignoring of the Security Council came with the Iraq War. I have a whole sermon about this. But to get back to your book, so a conventional analysis of what's happened to America that helps explain Trump is so globalization The upside is it's pulled tons of people out of poverty in India, in China. They filled these low-wage jobs and make these affordable products for us. The downside is that that's been a loss of American working-class jobs and or a stifling of wages for American workers. I would say your book is distinctive in a couple ways. I think you buy that part of the analysis. You also, though, emphasize automation a lot more than some people, which we've talked about, especially when you look forward to why there's going to be a continuing threat. But the other thing is, and this is really what a lot of the book is about, is you look at the countries that nominally are on the beneficiary side of this coin, like, okay, China, China and India's gain is our loss, but you see trouble ahead for almost everyone. I mean, that's maybe a slight oversimplification, but you spend a lot of the book looking at these various kind of developing countries, including the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia,
right.
India, China, and some other large developing economies, and saying, look, there may be trouble ahead on all of these fronts. Is that fair?
It is. I mean, I think that our governing systems today, particularly democratic governing systems today, are increasingly showing themselves as not being capable of responding fast enough to the changes in society. And it's leaving a lot of people behind, and it's creating much more risk of serious confrontation. Now, for me, yes, it's kind of a depressing book. But it reminds me, if I had been a climatologist writing a book on climate change 40 years ago, 30 years ago, I think the book would feel similar. Because this is ultimately a hopeful book. But if you're writing about something that you see coming, it's obvious, it's structural, it's macro, and we don't have the answers yet. And part of the reason we don't have the answers is because people aren't yet focusing on it. They're not willing to focus on it. It's a big, hairy thing, but it's coming long term. Then you don't write a book saying, here are the answers. You write a book saying, everyone, this is the next big thing. Right. And we have to start coming up with experiments that might eventually become scalable solutions. And I'm an optimistic person. I'm an enormously optimistic person. But this happens to be a topic that it's obvious it's going to have to get worse before it gets better. And I think that the people writing about climate change 30, 40 years ago, they didn't know what the solutions would be, but they had to first get people to say, everybody, like, we're putting unsustainable levels of carbon into the atmosphere. It's going to change our climate, and that's going to have major consequences. And 40 years later, I mean, for me today, looking at climate, I'm much more optimistic, because solar today is cheaper than coal during the day, because we're making huge advantages in battery storage and transmission technologies. I mean, these are amazing things that 30, 40 years ago weren't even conceivable. And now we see that we're starting to develop the technologies that will allow us to get through what's going to be a very disruptive and destructive period for humanity. And I think that this, particularly the technology piece, is one that we have not yet begun to seriously address. And so therefore I am being thrust in the role of being someone that has to tell a story that's not that great.
So automation in particular?
In particular, automation, but not just automation, technology. Technology 25 years ago was mostly about empowering individuals. Technology today is mostly about data, big data, surveillance, and empowering vertical institutions that have the money and the access to that information. It's authoritarian governments, and it's big oligopolistic corporations.
But don't you think it's a little more of a kind of a dialectic struggle? I mean, of course, the conventional wisdom 15 years ago was the opposite. These are technologies of liberation. They're decentralizing. Orwell was wrong. Huxley was right, or something like that. And it seems to me, now I myself, I had some of those hopes. It's become clearer to me how many naturally centralizing tendencies there are, and how, like, the corporations buy up the blogs and so on, and before long you've got a few media conglomerates again and so on, and the government clearly can do a lot at the same time. I mean in the way of surveillance. At the same time, you take even something like China, and I know this is a source of concern for you, the authoritarian impulse there. At the same time, as I think you note in the book, there are a ton of protests in China. People might not realize that. It's part of life. You can go do a protest. The way they organize their protests is I think, often with like cell phones, which isn't, they use some of the modern technologies of decentralization to register their discontent with the government. Honestly, it's not clear to me that the Chinese government does a worse job of responding to the expressed grievances of their people than the American government does.
I think that's a very important point. And I think if you ask me today which system is structurally in greater need of reform, the United States or China, the answer is we're not sure. And that's insane. I'm not Chomsky. 5 years ago, you'd say that. People would look at you like your hair was on fire. No one would agree with that in Washington today. But you leave the United States, and a lot of people are saying, yeah, it's a big question. But I do think that the momentum today is clearly towards technology empowering authoritarian regimes. That surveillance is allowing them to completely crack down on Xinjiang, facial recognition, satellite, big data. The Chinese are leading the world in facial recognition and voice recognition technology today, and it's because there's no presumption of privacy. And that's basically stopped instability among the Uyghurs in Xinjiang because the Chinese will find you and will end you. And that's what happened in Syria. I mean, you brought a few hundred Russians into Syria, coders, working with data, helping the Assad government and their military. Within 6 months, all the moderate rebels were gone. They were suppressed because they couldn't communicate. So I think that, now that could change, right? I mean, it might be that in 10 or 20 years, breakthroughs in quantum computing means that everyone has a hackable system and the governments no longer have the authority they do now. But if you ask me over the next 5 to 10 years, what I see now happening is a significant push towards empowering those institutions that control all that data. And that absolutely is bad for the U.S. government at a national level, bad for the American people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me a little... I would say, if you recall, during the Cold War, the Chinese people, the Russian people, the government basically had the capability to keep almost all their citizens from knowing any particular thing about the world out there, right? And
yes.
that's different for... those days are gone.
Those days are gone. So it's no longer about you keep people from having information, but it's about you can absolutely control what economic benefits they do and don't get, and on the basis of their behavior, on the basis of who they talk to, what they say, how they express themselves. And you've got the surveillance society is enormous. So people have access to information, but governments can control and manipulate what you're watching, what you're listening to. So in the United States, social media, driven by private sector and the profit impulse, means that you want to be more extreme, more narrow, treated like a consumer rather than a citizen. So as a consequence, we get more left-wing, more right-wing, more support for Alex Jones, more right. But in China, the Chinese government wants you to all support a state-supported narrative. And if you want the economic benefits, and if you don't want to be politically suppressed, then you listen to that. And I see that working.
Yeah.
And that worries me.
Yeah. No, it worries me too.
And also the fact that the Chinese government is investing in AI, artificial intelligence, as the most important strategic sector. That they are supporting their companies to become monopolies in their country and also expand beyond China. Where in the United States, the U.S. government's supporting coal, we're supporting steel, we're supporting automotive, but we really don't have a strategy for AI. I think it's a big problem for us.
Yeah. So quickly to hone in on this, again, the book I think is distinctive in seeing trouble, saying that the discontent manifest in Trump is a problem that goes beyond the U.S. and Europe, basically,
right.
Broadly speaking, and there is in all these countries, Brazil, Nigeria, etc. What are the main generic problems? I mean, one of them is certainly automation that you expect to start displacing the very workers who just, quote, stole our jobs from our workers. I mean the workers who just pulled themselves up, you expect them to become victimized by automation.
Yes,
that's one
absolutely.
thing.
Yes, that's one. The second is technology as this filter bubble. It's fake news. It's you only following people that you like, that you agree with.
The tribalizing tendency.
The tribalizing tendency of technologies, which really facilitates us versus them in a way that we've never seen before. It's very, very strong. And then I would say it's the anti-elite corruption sensibility. It's the fact that people feel like they've not gotten, that they're not represented well by those, by in the context of bigger structural inequality in these countries. Now, it's not anti-globalization in emerging markets, because in emerging markets, globalization has largely benefited them.
Right.
They're the ones that have gotten more jobs. So in Mexico and Brazil, you don't see poor people in the middle classes saying anti-free trade. So when Lopez Obrador won in Mexico, it wasn't on an anti-NAFTA platform. No. And in Brazil, they're very supportive of more trade, more open trade. Open borders depends on where you are. Right, because some of the countries that are being most squashed by refugees right now are poor countries that can't police their borders. So it's a country like Uganda, for example. It's Jordan, for example. It's not the West. It's not the United States and Europe. But then that really depends. That's much more sort of territorially or geographically specific.
Okay. And finally, you should just say that you do have a chapter about solutions. I don't think you have a single killer idea, but you talk about a lot of policies, almost entirely at the national level, right? The policies you're talking about.
I think a lot of them actually are private sector.
Well, okay. I mean, as opposed to transnational institutional reform.
Yes, that's right. Because I don't think it's going to happen. I think that there could be. It's a very good point. I think there could be, if we had a world. See, this is a book that's talking about how democracies aren't working and how populists are starting to, sort of help rip the fabric apart. But it's happening at the same time that we have a major geopolitical shift in the world, where Pax Americana is over and the Chinese are starting to build alternative infrastructure, but they're nowhere close to taking over the U.S. position, economically, militarily, you name it, which means that it's a uniquely bad time to think about transnational architecture as responding to these domestic problems, because we're now dismantling a lot of the transnational architecture we have. At best, it's fighting a rearguard action just to stay in place. At worst, it's eroding very significantly. So I think that the solutions are largely at the intra-country level, where governors and mayors and CEOs and philanthropists and maybe some central governments are going to start engaging in experiments with gig economy, with lifetime education, with universal basic income, some of which will succeed, some of which will fail, but we need a lot of those.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So on balance, are you optimistic, or I mean, in 30 years, do you think we'll be in a worse place?
On balance, I'm a very optimistic person. And when you said at the beginning that my book is in opposition to Steven Pinker on globalization, you're right. But my book is not in opposition to Factfulness by Hans Rosling, a wonderful book. And it's a much more optimistic book than this one, but it's very complimentary, because he's writing about all the great things in the world that are happening, but that I'm not an expert on. So the demographic changes, and you look at the sustainability of demographics as people get wealthier and better educated. Think about what globalization has done with improving our lifespan to over 70 now. Globally, that the average 1-year-old, 90% of them get immunizations. That's extraordinary, despite the anti-vaxxer tendencies in some parts of the United States. Like, if you look at what's happening to humanity, we've never lived at a time when people, just regular people, not Americans, not Europeans, just regular people, have had so little misery, so little challenge. And these challenges that I write about, that are my expertise, they're very big structural problems, and yet we're going to have so many more billions of people that will be educated that can help apply themselves at fixing these problems. For most of the problems of our lifetimes, we've been stuck with white men to figure out the answers. And I'm not saying we're not capable, but there aren't that many of us, right? So if we're actually able to start addressing these problems using women around the world, using Chinese around the world, Indians, Africans in cities, suddenly you say, wow, like that's a lot of brain power with, the smartest people we know. And that makes me very optimistic. So I don't think you can be pessimistic looking at where the world is heading. I think it's an extraordinary time to be alive, and people that are as fortunate as you and I to do what we do for a living kind of have an obligation to be a part of the change. Okay, well, you're leaving me where I want to be, in a good happy mood. I'm upbeat. This is the book. Where can people follow you on Twitter? Is it just Ian Bremmer? At Ian Bremmer. So that's the way to do it, yeah. Makes sense to me. Right. Okay, well, thanks so much for taking the time. Great pleasure, Bob.